In the early 1980s, an emergency closed meeting of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was convened. Present in the room, the top leaders of the country and high-ranking officers of the KGB. Soviet intelligence had just delivered to the General Secretary a truly shocking report. The United States was preparing a nuclear strike. Agents had detected a sudden increase in communication traffic between the U.S. and the United Kingdom. All NATO countries had been placed on maximum alert. Across Western Europe, large-scale military exercises had begun, codenamed Able Archer. During these drills, for the first time, NATO forces used new secret communication codes and operated under complete radio silence. To the Soviet leadership, it looked like a carefully disguised preparation for a preemptive nuclear attack. The Soviet strategic missile forces were placed on readiness level 1. Additional nuclear bombers were deployed to Eastern Europe. The world stood still on the brink of nuclear war. In March 1976, the Soviet Union unveiled a new missile system, the Pioneer, a weapon capable of destroying enemy targets at a range of up to 5,000 kilometers. This new missile was intended to replace the aging S-75 Dvina surface-to-air systems and the R-14 land-based ballistic missiles. The Soviet leadership believed that the Pioneer would help restore the strategic balance with NATO. At that time, across Western Europe and along the maritime borders of the USSR, U.S. Air Force and naval units had deployed nuclear warheads, a constant source of headache and concern for the Soviet command. The United States Department of Defense viewed the new Soviet missile system as an undeniable threat, declaring that Soviet military power was now one step away from achieving superiority over America. They called it the window of vulnerability. The response came immediately. At a NATO meeting in Brussels, member states approved the deployment of 470 long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles and more than 100 Pershing II ballistic missiles. Across Western Europe, the Pershing II had an extremely short flight time to Soviet borders, while the Tomahawks were nearly impossible to detect by radar. In the event of a sudden, disarming nuclear strike, the Soviet Union would have no time and no means to respond. Relations between the world's nuclear powers continued to deteriorate amid a series of crises in the Third World, after special units of the KGB and the Soviet Army eliminated Hafizullah Amin and deployed a limited contingent of Soviet troops to Afghanistan. The United States responded immediately. Washington canceled all bilateral trade with the Soviet Union and imposed a series of economic sanctions. Shipments of oil and gas equipment and advanced electronics were banned. All joint projects in space exploration and energy cooperation were completely suspended. The global standoff was entering a dangerous new phase. In September 1981, the Soviet Union conducted the largest military exercise in its history, an operational strategic drill of the Soviet Army and the Warsaw Pact forces, codenamed Zapad 81. During these maneuvers, the USSR tested an automated command and control system, along with new types of high-precision weaponry. The exercises simulated a large-scale offensive, in which victory was achieved not through nuclear strikes, but through superiority in conventional forces and precision firepower. They practiced massive artillery and air assaults and a large-scale airborne landing behind enemy lines. The drills took place near the Polish border, and the U.S. Department of Defense interpreted them as a possible rehearsal for the deployment of Soviet troops into Poland. In the following year, 1982, the Soviet Union conducted another massive military exercise involving the Army, the Navy, and all Warsaw Pact member states. The operation was codenamed Shield 82. The drills extended across the entire territory of the Soviet Union. Troops were trained to operate under the conditions of a rapidly unfolding thermonuclear war. In the first stage of the exercise, forces practiced carrying out a preemptive nuclear strike against the enemy. The second stage simulated military operations in the aftermath of a full-scale nuclear exchange. During the drills, dozens of intercontinental ballistic missiles were launched. Cruise missiles were fired from strategic bombers and naval vessels of the Soviet fleet. In the West, these exercises were soon dubbed the 7-Hour Nuclear War. American military analysts concluded that the unprecedented number of missile launches might have revealed the Kremlin's real plan to deliver a sudden, devastating nuclear strike against the territory of the United States. In Washington, an emergency meeting was held. During the discussion, the U.S. Department of Defense was ordered to prepare a response, one that would bring the Soviet leadership back to its senses and make it absolutely clear, in the event of a nuclear war, there stood no chance. That response was already in the making. In March 1983, the United States launched one of its largest naval exercises in the northern Pacific Ocean, Operation Fleet X. During the drills, American forces simulated strikes against Soviet nuclear submarines. Soon after, the Pentagon issued an unprecedented directive to provoke the Soviet side in order to analyze its tactics and response procedures. American military aircraft violated Soviet airspace 6 times and even carried out a simulated nuclear strike on Zeleny Island, part of a lesser Kuril chain. In response, Soviet strategic bombers were scrambled into the sky. They, in turn, violated U.S. airspace over Nunivak Island, Alaska, and conducted a mock nuclear attack of their own. By August 1983, Soviet intelligence detected a massive transfer of U.S. forces to Europe. Within a single month, under complete radio silence, U.S. Air Command executed 185 airlifts, delivering troops and military equipment to Western Europe. Across all NATO countries, mobilization was declared. Soviet analysts could not determine whether this was merely an exercise or preparation for an actual war. The Soviet response came swiftly. The Navy launched Operation Okine 83, a global series of naval maneuvers involving around 50 warships and a large number of submarines. The drills included airstrikes on enemy convoys and extended across nearly the entire world's oceans. Simulated attacks were carried out in the Norwegian Sea, the Mediterranean, and the South China Sea, as well as in the North Atlantic, the Baltic, the Indian Ocean, and the Northwestern Pacific. A vast fleet of Soviet naval aviation took part, launching from bases in Vietnam, Syria, Libya, Ethiopia, and Cuba, as well as directly from Soviet territory. On November 2, 1983, the United States and its NATO allies began a massive military exercise, codenamed Able Archer. The operation spanned the entire territory of Western Europe. Soviet intelligence believed that these large-scale NATO maneuvers were in fact a cover for a real nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. Agents reported that across Western Europe, under conditions of strictest secrecy, NATO forces had been placed on high alert, a possible sign of preparation for a surprise nuclear attack. In peacetime, through its network of spies, the Soviet side also discovered that several key Western leaders were personally involved in Operation Able Archer. Among them, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, U.S. President Ronald Reagan, and Vice President George H.W. Bush. The next piece of intelligence, delivered to the first chief directorate of the KGB, came as a shock to the Soviet leadership. It was confirmed that NATO had switched to a new, unique encryption system for its communications, a move the Soviets interpreted as direct preparation for nuclear launch operations. For the Soviet leadership, these days marked the absolute peak of tension. Across Western Europe, NATO forces were placed on maximum combat readiness. The U.S. strategic nuclear forces were also put on high alert. The world was standing one step away from the outbreak of nuclear war. From Moscow, urgent encrypted messages were sent to Soviet agents abroad. In these communications, the Soviet leadership demanded to determine as quickly as possible the true intentions of the United States. At the same time, the CIA detected alarming signs that the Soviet Union was preparing for a preemptive nuclear strike. U.S. intelligence reported increased military activity across the Baltic Military District, in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, and within the German Democratic Republic. At several air bases, nuclear-capable bombers were being readied for takeoff. In multiple Eastern Bloc countries, nuclear storage facilities were suddenly opened. Across the entire Soviet Union, intercontinental ballistic missiles were placed on immediate launch readiness. The world stood still, on the brink of nuclear apocalypse. The tension finally began to subside after November 11th, when the United States announced the end of Operation Able Archer. To this day, most information about the nuclear standoff of 1983 remains classified. Many experts believe that the events of that year were even more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world, quite literally, stood on the brink of global nuclear war. In response, the scientists of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the hands of the Doomsday clock to 23:57, 3 minutes to midnight. For the first time in many years, humanity had come so close to midnight, the moment symbolizing nuclear annihilation.